مساء الخير جميعا. هيدي الجلسة رح تكون باللغة الإنجليزية، فاللي عم بيسمعنا وحابب يسمع للترجمة، في أحد زملائي رح يحط لينك من زوم ورح نبلش هلأ. Good evening everyone and welcome to this session about freedom of expression in Lebanon. I'm happy and I'm very glad to have two great advocates for freedom of expression in Lebanon and the region as well, and I can call them friends. I am Azoub from Human Rights Watch and Ayman Mhanna from Skies. And also we are missing lawyer Diala Shhadi, who will be joining us in a minute. So today we're going to be speaking about freedom of expression in terms of like, we know there has been some challenges. We know of what happened in the last year. There has been some explosion, August 4, there has been uprising, October 17. But we can see also that there has been some opportunities. So we want to talk about these both angles and see how we can look for the future and where are the challenges and where we need to put our focus to actually circumvent some of these challenges, so we can open more and more the space for better freedom of expression in Lebanon. We will start with you, Aya. Aya, you've been very active with the Human Rights Watch, especially within the uprising, also after explosion of Beirut. So for every opportunity, Human Rights Watch and yourself, you have been active, you have been pushing the dynamic. If you want to tell us a little bit how you see the Lebanese context.
Thank you, first of all, for having this really, really important discussion at such a critical time for the country. So I think, very few people will disagree that the space for free speech in the country has been restricting and declining over the last several years. And, one of the main tools that we've seen politicians and public officials and security forces resort to silence people criticizing them has been the country's criminal defamation laws, which in many cases authorize imprisonment of up to 3 years. Now, these laws have been on the books since the early 20th century, so they're nothing new. But what's been really striking has been seeing the increasing use of them by these politicians. So we were able to obtain numbers from security agencies between 2015 and 2019 on the number of these defamation cases that they had investigated. And we found that there had been a 325% increase between 2015 and 2018 in the use of these defamation laws. We've now requested information for 2019 and 2020, but we haven't heard back. And we can discuss, later some of the hurdles that we face in Lebanon in obtaining information and what some of the impediments to access for information is in Lebanon. But to go back to these defamation laws and the way that they've been used. Now, by no means, I'm not saying by any means that they're the only restriction on free speech in the country, but our research has shown that they are one of the main tools that has been consistently used by politicians from across the political spectrum to silence people who are insulting them or speaking against them. And our research showed that actually one of the main reasons that politicians and public officials and businessmen file complaints against individuals is if these individuals have accused them of corruption. So instead of committing to tackling corruption at a time like this in the country, the political elite have responded to threats to the status quo with repression and politically motivated prosecutions, especially targeting individuals and journalists who are leveling accusations of corruption. Now, almost all states have some form of defamation laws that individuals can resort to if they felt that their reputation was being unfairly damaged. But Lebanon's laws are so vague and overbroad, and they don't abide by Lebanon's obligations under international law. So, for example, these laws are criminal, which means that individuals may be imprisoned if found guilty, imprisoned for peaceful speech, for a post, for a tweet. And that in itself is in violation of Lebanon's obligations under international law. The second really outrageous thing is that truth isn't a defense in all cases. So you can be prosecuted and even sentenced to jail, even if what you said was true. The third problem with the laws is that public officials have special protection from defamation. So the penalties for defaming public officials are higher than they are for private citizens, even though there's a greater public interest in criticizing public figures and authorities. And then finally, the law allows civilians to be tried in military courts if the defamatory content was directed against any member of the civilian institution. And the military judicial system is one that lacks even the most basic safeguards for free trial. So the criminal defamation laws are themselves outdated, but what's even more worrying is that we've documented that the authorities, from the public prosecution to the security agencies to the judiciary, act improperly and sometimes illegally in these cases to intimidate and silence people. And they a clear bias towards the powerful individual who filed these cases. So people we spoke with said that they were arrested very violently, that during their interrogation they were threatened, physically or verbally abused. Their phones were sometimes searched even without a judicial order. And then at the end of the investigation, they were made to sign a pledge saying that they wouldn't insult the person who filed the complaint again in the future. And that in itself also is a violation of free speech, because here's the person is forced to remove content before even appearing before a judge or a court. Now, the spate of these prosecutions unfortunately hasn't slowed down over the last year. We've seen many journalists and activists, particularly those who have been very vocal in the October 17 revolution, be targeted under these vague and overbroad defamation laws. But to end on a more hopeful note, I think there are several opportunities. So first, civil society is now much more organized. So we've joined together with 13 other local and international groups under the Coalition to Defend Freedom of Expression in Lebanon. And so we have a coordinated response to the increasing restriction of free speech in Lebanon. And it's obvious that the government took note of this development, because the day that we were launching the coalition, there were about 4 military trucks stationed outside of the venue where we were having the press conference. So clearly that caused a bit of alarm among the authorities. But more importantly, I think we've started to see a public opinion shift on this matter. So before the October 17th protest, Hamad, SMEX organized some roundtables with Lebanese youth from across the political spectrum to talk about free speech in the country, and particularly their opinions regarding these defamation and insult provisions. And what was really shocking to me, at least, was that most young people, at least in these roundtables, seemed to support these provisions. So we constantly heard things like, no, I don't think you should be able to insult the president. No, you shouldn't be able to insult religious figures. Why should you have a right to insult my political leader? So that was the sort of discourse that we were hearing, even among young people. But I think that that's really changed during the October 17 revolution. So I had several talks in the squares talking about free speech and in particular defamation. And most young people were pretty alarmed to learn that under Lebanese law, they could be put in jail, prosecuted and put in jail for the chants that they and hundreds of thousands of other people were repeating in the streets. So I think there's a greater appreciation now for the value in being able to insult religious figures. So they're not anymore things that are aib, contrary to morals or ethics, but things that are a tool of political opposition. And people see, young people in particular, see the value in being able to say these things publicly without fear of prosecution. And, but before the October 17 revolution, many activists and journalists would go into these investigations and nobody would know. So security forces could, hold them for several hours, intimidate them, threaten them, force them to remove content, and nobody was any the wiser. Nobody knew what was happening. But now there's much more awareness about this issue. So if a journalist or an activist was being called in for interrogation, you'll have social media accounts publicizing this, you'll have opposition, you'll have civil society responding to it, and you'll have people congregated outside of the police station or security agency where the individual is being interrogated. And that shows that people are watching, people are aware, and security agencies and prosecutors can't get away with what they used to get away with before, with several people gathered outside of the police station waiting for the individual to come out. So I really do think that this public awareness hopefully will be a deterrent to more violations in these defamation cases. So I'll stop there, and then maybe we can have a broader discussion during the Q&A.
Okay, so let's keep it here. So basically, that's a great description of the problems and the issues that happen pre and post October 17 movement. I will try to ask Ayman about. I of being like a watchdog for all kind of journalism, threats on journalists, and different kind of activities to promote free press. How have you seen the trends happening pre and post October 17? Like, if you can describe or frame for us the issues and the trends that you've seen in terms of threats.
Thank you, Muhammad. Thank you, Aya. Always fascinating to be with you. Muhammad, I will start with talking about the trends and try to see afterwards the big picture. Perhaps that big picture can also lead us to some changes in the coming period. I'll give you a few numbers related to our monitoring of violations targeting journalists and media professionals and people who are freedom of expression activists before and after October 2020. Which means, 2019. So we will be looking at the year from the 1st of October 2018 to the 30th of September 2019. So that 12 months. And then the 12 months that start on the 1st of October 2019. And the numbers are horrible. Let's start with one of the really bad developments, assaults on journalists by non-state actors. Because since 2011, roughly, attacks on journalists have mainly come by non-state actors. Usually they are the partisans of the big political parties, their supporters in general. 12 attacks in the 12 months that preceded October 2019, 97 attacks from October 2019 to September 2020, from 12 to 97 in 1 year. This is a 708% increase in 1 year. Attacks by non-state actors. None of these attacks has led to any kind of accountability, to any kind of action by the judiciary or by law enforcement. What is worse, because they are not supposed to act like this, is the attack on journalists and the assaults on journalists, physical assaults on journalists by the security forces. For years in Lebanon, except in 2015, the number of attacks by security forces has been limited, probably lower than what you can see even in Western Europe and in North America. But in 1 year, we jumped from 3 attacks from October 2018 to September 2019 to, a year later, 77 attacks. So we're talking here about a 2,466% increase. It's something that reveals how much the political elite in Lebanon is now using everything it has in its power, both on the non-official side and on the security forces side, to stifle free speech and to prevent the popular movement from continuing its actions on the ground. And we cannot deny that it has had a chilling effect. Violence is one of the reasons probably why we don't see people on the streets as much as during the earlier months of the Intifada. But this doesn't stop here. The summons, the interrogations of journalists and activists on freedom of expression ground almost doubled from 19 to 36. The threats, the harassment, the intimidation of journalists on freedom of expression ground has also increased tremendously from 7 to 23. And finally, detention of journalists and activists on freedom of expression ground also doubled from 9 to 18. These numbers are important, but let's try to make sense of the numbers. What do we have today that is the real obstacle or the main obstacles for freedom of expression in Lebanon? First, the legal framework. Aya gave a wonderful presentation of the legal framework in Lebanon and how much it constrains freedom of expression. But the second major element is related to safety of journalists. In Lebanon, journalists are not safe. I am not talking about journalists being killed. You know, I work for the Samir Qasir Foundation, which carries the name of a journalist who was assassinated with absolutely no accountability whatsoever afterwards, total impunity for perpetrators of crimes. But this impunity doesn't stop at the level of crimes. It affects every single type of physical attack on journalists. So without that safety element, we cannot ask journalists to remain free, independent, and to continue their work with the same level of enthusiasm. The two other elements are the technological element, and this is where SMEC plays a wonderful role in terms of journalists' digital safety and the general public's digital rights in general. People are not realizing how much this will be used in order to surveil journalists, to monitor what they write. So without a global culture related to online safety and digital safety, the next few years will be worse, even if on paper, the numbers of physical assaults drop. And finally, and this is my last point for this first question, we cannot ignore the economic situation's impact on freedom of the press. Journalism cannot continue if journalism does not allow people working in the sector to get a decent salary, to get a decent pay, to provide for their needs and the needs of their families. So without a media sector that is viable, that is independent, the media sector might remain hostage to political capture and political funding. We're seeing what is happening on TV, for example. On the one hand, you might have TV stations that were very enthusiastic for political change, but they need advertisement. And advertisement, for some, is only coming from the banking sector that is driving a particular narrative. We cannot talk about a free, independent, investigative journalism if it's beholden to the interest of a few, whether that few has business interests or political interests. So we also need to convene brainstorming sessions, thinking sessions, strategy sessions in order to think together of the most effective business models that can ensure the independence, the viability, and financial sustainability of the media sector in order for that media sector to play its role and to speak truth to power. Otherwise, they will also remain vulnerable to many other types of pressure that can reduce freedom of expression in Lebanon. I'm happy to answer other questions. Back to you, Muhammad.
Thank you, Ayman. Thank you for this great framework. And welcome, Diala Shhade. Diala, can you hear us? Okay. So until we know what's happening with Diala, let's go back to you, Aya. So we have been talking about the penal code, defamation, the qatl wadam, for all these issues and how much this has been used against activists and citizens. So I mean, so the questions that come to mind, yes, the social norm maybe have changed since October 17, but now we feel like the tension is happening. Like now there's like the political elite, the current structure. It's not only political, it's societal, it's cultural, it's religious as well, it's everything, against the people who are revolting against all these norms including the right to express themselves and maybe use all kind of expression in their speech. So the questions that come to mind and that many people ask, what can we do to actually provide a new legal framework or a new space protective for those activists? And this is not a question only for you, like this is also for us. I mean, just like to think together about it, but just like I'm throwing it there if there is any questions or answers that you can say.
So this is spot on. This is always the dilemma of advocacy group research and advocacy groups like us is, okay, we've now documented all of the violations, but how do we turn that into legal and policy change? So I think the coalition is a good example of this. So I'll describe sort of the impetus behind the coalition. So there has been, over the last several years, there has been a realization in Lebanon that Lebanon's laws relating to the media, or the media law, need to be changed and updated due to the prevalence of social media. Currently, the law is unclear. How do you regulate social media? Is it a publication? Is it not? So it's a bit unclear. So there has been, agreement that these laws need to be updated. And there has been a law in Parliament, a new media law that has been proposed more than 10 years ago by Maharat and former MP Ghassan Khayber, that was intended to improve the landscape for free speech and free media in the country. But unfortunately, over the last 10 years, it had been amended so many times in Parliament that the version that they have ended up with now is not better, and in some places even worse than our current laws. And so as, we as advocacy groups, as civil society, have been trying to advocacy and lobby do advocacy with and lobby parliamentarians on the need to change some of the most problematic provisions of this draft law, sorry. And we, our efforts weren't successful. And then, months later, we received a response from a parliamentarian saying, you have 2 days to give us comments on this law, which is absolutely preposterous. And it's a tick box exercise for Parliament to say we consulted with civil society, but without really any meaningful way to establish dialogue. So the rights community wanted to put out a joint statement saying that this is not the way that you should be dealing with civil society, but also outlining what we think were some of the main problems with the law. And then the revolution happened. So obviously all of that was put on hold. And then the impetus behind the coalition was actually us finding out that this draft law was back on the agenda in Parliament's committees. And so immediately we formed this coalition in order to present a united front and do joint advocacy with parliamentarians on why this draft law shouldn't be allowed to pass the way it was, and what improvements need to be made to the law to bring it in line with Lebanon's obligations under international law. Now, one of the, Lebanon is a bit of a unique country in the region in that it really depends a lot on donor money, donor funds for everything from social services, education, healthcare, even security. And so they often do, the Lebanese authorities often do have to pander to the international community. They have to say the right things. They have to adopt certain laws that the international community puts pressure on them to adopt. And so we also use those tools available to us, the delegations, international delegations in Lebanon, to put pressure on Lebanon to abide by its international obligations. So that's one, that's also an answer to one of the questions that was asked, are there lobbying and advocacy activities happening? So that's, on the one hand, how we're trying to exert pressure on Lebanon. The other is through the UN system. So Lebanon is currently up for its Universal Periodic Review. So it's every 5 years, the Human Rights Council reviews each country's human rights record. And states are usually quite sensitive to this review. It's a public review where states in the Human Rights Council get to question Lebanon on its rights records and question what advancements it had made from the recommendations that were given to it the previous 5 years. So it's an opportunity also for us. We've been engaging with those members of the Human Rights Council to demonstrate the regression in free speech over the last 5 years in the country and try to give them recommendations that they will in turn give to Lebanon during this UN Universal Periodic Review, which is going to happen on January 18th for Lebanon. So that's another advocacy for change. And then the third is just one-on-one advocacy with parliamentarians themselves. There are some parliamentarians who are, who understand the importance of free speech and who sometimes are willing to engage civil society and, translate those into legislative change.
Thank you, Aya. This is super interesting. I mean, in terms of like the parliament, I know like all of us here on the call, we used to like talk to parliamentarians and all that, but I feel like after October 17, the dynamic have changed, and honestly, there's like I'm not sure how much we can still talk to them. I mean, from one hand, there's really nothing that is really changing. I mean, there's only like the new media law that is still a draft, and we don't know what's going to happen with it, and it's still in the parliament for many years now. Like you mentioned, it's a law between Maharat and Mkhayber, but it has changed a lot, and we don't even have access to the draft. Like we don't even have access to information. Ayman, yourself and Skies have worked before on access to information. Like, can we talk a little bit about other aspects that actually affects freedom of expression, like access to information? Like, what are the issues that we need to think about when it comes to freedom of expression, and that goes hand in hand to boost the space for citizens?
Yeah, access to information is not only something we all need and deserve in order to continue our work and act as real citizens, but this is talking about the international commitments of Lebanon. This is one of the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically Goal 1610, public access to information. So it is something that we have to use also in our conversation with the Lebanese authorities, but with the international partners of Lebanon as well. And access to information today is more important than ever. I'm not talking here about the technicalities of the law related to access to information. I'm talking about one key word: accountability. And this has been the missing ingredient of every single recovery mechanism that Lebanon has always gone through. I'm not only talking about the civil war. Think about every single tragedy in Lebanon since 1943. All of them, in a way, ended missing one ingredient, which is accountability. And this is what we are really scared to repeat again this time, in the sense that, okay, there will be an economic collapse. Oh, too bad. People lost their money. We will have potentially security problems related to, all the regional dynamics that are quite shaky, to say the least, right now in Lebanon. And at the end, we'll look at it as if it's a fate that we were doomed to experience. And we always miss the key point: accountability. Who knew what? Who knew what and when? What kind of information was available? Who had this information? What did they do with the information? This is no longer something related to the technicalities of journalistic work and Mr. Mkhayber presenting a decree here and a law there. We're here talking about something fundamental. This country is not viable if we do not build back better. And building back better means not accepting anymore to that regular sentence, Afa Allah an mamada. I mean, let's forget what happened in the past and move forward. No, we're not moving forward. It's an anchor that is keeping Lebanon in a situation of complete failure to deliver to its citizens, failure to put the country on the path to future if we do not focus on accountability. And there is no accountability if we do not ask the question about what happened, who knew what, when, what are the numbers, how can we verify them? We're talking here about the August 4 explosion, but we're talking about the corruption, we're talking about the security situation in Lebanon and all the parties that have the power to put the country on the brink of war at any second. If we do not look at access to information from the angle of something to save the country, because only accountability will save us, we will have such a technical and boring look at it that only, you know, people like us, wonks and Excel nerds will enjoy it, because they will see an open data document here and there. It's not about open data, and it's not about, you know, numbers. It's about an idea to put accountability at the center stage of building the country better. That was my political moment.
Wow, that's awesome. Okay, طيب, so I totally agree. I mean, yes and yes. I mean, this is the issue. I mean, if we look really at freedom of expression issue, it's really not about freedom of expression. It's not a goal by itself. It's only to achieve all the other goals that we all think about. But everything stayed on the same, on the first steps, on the shallowness of freedom of expression. I have the right to express myself, and that's it. No, expression by itself is only like, I mean, of course it is something, but it is a medium to achieve something. Yeah, can you tell us about a campaign that we can build up on and see if we if we can achieve any success in terms of like breaking this wall when it comes to freedom of expression? I mean, is there any campaign or any advocacy or something that have been done or you have seen in the last year or two that might have some potential success in the country?
I always, when people ask me for examples of success in Lebanon, I'm always at a loss for words, because unfortunately over the last year, it's been one failure after the other. But I just want to, I think as you both said, I think freedom of expression should be put in the context of the general decline of rights in Lebanon, whether it's civil and political rights or social and economic rights. And you know, I want to comment on a few things that Ayman said on lack of accountability. So I think, you know, two things. I'll first comment on the lack of accountability, and then on the access to information as well. So on the lack of accountability, you know, we've faced a chronic lack of accountability in Lebanon, whether it's for violating people's right to free speech, whether it's attacks on journalists, attacks on citizens during protest. I mean, all of it. And what's been, I do think though that sustained pressure, particularly on security forces, has made somewhat, I'm not going to say it's a success, but somewhat of a difference. So for example, after the, you know, on January 15, if I'm not mistaken, Ayman, there was a protest outside the Hello police station where journalists were specifically targeted by members of the police. And that generated such an outcry that both the Interior Minister and the head of the ISF both publicly said that it's unacceptable and that there will be investigations. Unfortunately, like anything else in Lebanon, they promise an investigation and then the public never hears. But we have been, you know, that has opened up space for us and other rights groups to meet directly with these individuals and to press them on the need to, one, engage with civil society groups, and B, to make results of accountability proceedings public. On one, we succeeded, on two, we didn't. So before, we would send countless letters and meeting requests to security agencies, most of which were unanswered. But since over the last several months, since the October protests, I think there has been more pressure on them to respond. And so we've seen much more engagement by the security forces on issues of violence during protests. So we've been able to meet with the army, the ISF, the Interior Minister, even Parliament Police felt enough pressure. And for those who aren't in Lebanon, Parliament Police is a quasi-official security force that's tasked with protecting Parliament, but in reality, nobody knows what their budget is, what their chain of command is, whether they go through regular, security force training. For all purposes, they are seen as the defenders of Speaker of Parliament Nabih Berri. And they've been responsible for a huge number of the abuses against protesters. And for a long time, they refused completely to meet with civil society groups. But because due to pressure from civil society groups, watchdog organizations, they have been more and more open to meeting with civil society groups, and they have felt the need to explain themselves. Now, most of the explanations aren't really based in facts, but there's been a dialogue that's established, whereas previously they didn't even feel the need to respond. That's one, so sustained pressure works. On the other, the issue of access to information, I mean, completely agree with Ayman. I think there needs to be a complete culture shift. So we've been using we have a law on access to information that unfortunately isn't being applied by most institutions, and we constantly request data and information from state institutions. And usually the response is, why do you need this data? They view it as us asking them for a favor, us asking state institutions for a favor, rather than asking for, rather than this information is our right. So I do think that as Ayman said, there definitely needs to be a complete culture change around the access to information and making it, sustained pressure to make it so that these institutions know that this data should be publicly accessible. They don't need to know why we're requesting this data. We don't need to give a reason. They should be accessible to the Lebanese public.
Thank you, Aya. I mean, this is really fascinating. One of the issues that we actually work on, and we didn't talk about yet, is really like how much surveillance is happening and how much data collection is happening from the state agencies. But that's really something that we don't see or we don't feel directly, like freedom of expression. I mean, freedom of expression we talk about all the time because we know ex-politician, he sued or they sued as a political party, Y activist, and this person need to go to the investigation. But like in 2018, there has been this huge report that in any other country could have created a big embarrassment for the state, but nothing happened in Lebanon about all the surveillance that has been happening from the general security with like Dar Karakal. So the Dar Karakal has been really doing a lot of surveillance until it was discovered, and we also don't know if it's still happening or not. And there has been tons of journalists, a lot of bank managers, activists, politicians, and many other people. There was a lot of data that's being collected on them. So we don't really know if those people has been threatened, or they actually they were working after that for some favors for whoever the party that was doing the surveillance. And digging more into like the surveillance law, and it's still called eavesdropping because it's really an old law from the 1990s. And there was like this committee. That committee really doesn't have enough authority, and they have some kind of points in this law that allows them to do some kind of mass surveillance with the approval of the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense. So yes, access to information is important, but also going back to the digital space, and now all the information has been exchanging online. This has been an issue, and while we covered it, but I don't think I think this is still needs more covering, because we don't know the end results. I mean, we don't know what happened. We don't know which agency has been doing this surveillance, and we don't know who are the targets specifically. And we also noticed in the October 17 uprising, there has been a lot of arrests after that, where citizens or protesters has been asked to leave their phones, and some of them has been asked to open their phones. And those people were not, I mean, they didn't do anything wrong, so there's no crime. So many lawyers have been challenging this. We are also now challenging this. We're doing some research about the phone seizure and all the illegality of it. But if you can like talk a little bit, if you have seen some of those cases, mainly, I mean, Aya, as a Human Rights Watch, I'm sure you, if you have collected a few cases from those, if you can tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so we have, so during investigations, during interrogations by security agencies, we have documented security forces searching through people's phones, even without a judicial order. And when a person is in a security agency being surrounded by, you know, in one example, there was a person being interrogated at the Cybercrimes Bureau, surrounded by several security officers. If they ask you to turn over your phone, you will turn, you know, in 9 out of 10 cases, you will turn over your phone. But over here, I think there has been a legal improvement that I think should make these cases less common, which is that Article 47 of the Code of Criminal Procedure was recently amended to allow lawyers to be present in investigations with defendants. And so that, I think, should act, and I think part of the article's update was also to install cameras in security agencies or security rooms where people were being interrogated. So I think these amendments will help, if implemented properly, will definitely help to decrease instances where security forces search through people's phones in a police station or in any other security agency without a judicial warrant. That's one. But I think you raise an important issue broadly about surveillance in Lebanon. And the reality is that there is a lot of surveillance in Lebanon, but we just have no idea how this data is being used. So I remember walking around the protest sites in Lebanon at the beginning of the revolution. And if you look up on almost every single post or every single traffic light, there's a camera on top. So clearly there is monitoring and it's not just around protest sites. I started looking, and actually the presence of security cameras was so prevalent in Beirut, at least. So you have to wonder, where is this information going? Who is collecting this information? Who is, are they being stored in a way that respects people's rights and privacy? Who can look through this data? For what purposes are they used? Unfortunately, we don't have the answers, but we do know that Beirut is a city that is heavily surveilled. So that's one. But also we saw during protests in particular, security forces filming protesters. I at least haven't seen evidence of those films being used in cases against protesters now during the October 17 revolution. But we know that these videos have been used against protesters in the 2015 protests. So that as well raises questions regarding rights and privacy. But as you say, the legal framework in Lebanon regarding surveillance and data privacy isn't developed. And that's an issue where I think organizations like SMACS could be instrumental in updating our legislation on these issues.
Thank you, Aya. I want to try to get Diala if she's with us. Because Diala has worked on one case in terms of like phone seizure, very successful result. Diala, if you can unmute yourself, if you can hear me, because we want to get your feedback on this case. Diala, can you hear us? Okay. So back to you, Ayman. I know, like always, one of the main targets of surveillance journalists. And you, I mean, the organization that you are now the executive director, Sky's Samir Kassir. I mean, he's been of course one of the targets of probably analog surveillance. But moving now to the digital space, did you like document some of the cases against journalists, how this really affected their work? how this really affected their freedom of expression and to exposing corruption and all that? I mean, is there any documentation of these cases?
I cannot say that there is a direct documentation of one journalist or 2 or 10 who have changed their behavior because of surveillance. But this is a prevailing feeling in the sector that all security forces, the competing security forces, each having its own sectarian and political alignment, as well as non-state actors that are supported by, that have state-like powers, engage in surveillance. And journalists have integrated this information. And they know that it's better for them, if they want to stay safe, to avoid some topics, even talking about them. So it is stifling the way they communicate. It leads to some levels of self-censorship, but I cannot say that there is enough evidence other than circumstantial, given that people do not, this is the difficulty in documenting self-censorship. But yes, we are aware of cases, including Samir Kassir's wife, the president of the Samir Kassir Foundation, Giselle Khouri, who was very openly targeted by through NSO technology for a while, and the case is very, very well known. So even if it's not happening in Lebanon, this is a practice that is happening across the region, which might affect Lebanese journalists. So again, in that matter, of course, we have to monitor, we have to document these things and to take legal actions. But let's be honest, in every single country where surveillance was a common practice, the practice did not change because the law changed or because the decree changed. The practice changed because there was a political change. It's because there were new politicians who decided that the society cannot continue to live under surveillance and be a successful society. That paradigm shift happened in the late 1990s in Eastern Europe. It happened in many other countries, probably in Tunisia after 2011. It happens also sometimes in Western democracies when there is a change in government towards slightly more liberal or progressive governments. So let's not kid ourselves and think that with this current political class, there will be any change to the behavior. You cannot ask people who are not Democrat with small d in their own political parties, in their own families, to suddenly act like Democrats suddenly because they are in the executive or legislative branch. It's actually a failure, a naivete from our side to think that with this political class, there can be any change when it comes to surveillance, when it comes to empowering the judiciary to do its work properly. So if we really want to change that element, we need to keep talking about it, highlight cases, and push for political change.
Thank you, Ayman. So there's no hope with this political elites that we have, and
not only for freedom of expression. I think honestly, it's not being pessimistic. It's being the most realistic possible. Yeah. There is no hope, and you can include any other theme or any other sector after there is no hope with this current political class.
I agree with you, and Aya seems to agree. Diala is listening to us, I think. Hi, Diala. Can you hear me? Diala, we can't hear you, even though they put yourself on mute. Gharib. Diala, can you hear us? Okay. No one can hear her, right? Okay. So let's try to so we still have like 10 minutes. Let's try to think about Aya just mentioned that there's the Article 47, like the thing that happened. That's really a positive win, and lawyers will be using it, and we have been actually witnessing in the last week or 2 weeks some not clashes, like tension between the syndicate and also clashes, like some between the syndicates of lawyers and the police and the members of the police, and also the judges are supporting the lawyers. And we have seen yesterday or 2 days ago, like this statement or a press document or whatever we want to call it from the head of the police to other policeman to actually detain anyone for 24 hours, and following whatever law or whatever procedures that happened before. If any one of you have followed this case, and what do you think about it, and how we should actually change that?
Maybe I'll start. I mean, if it is true, and if the police decided based on, undigging or digging, unveiling a text from many years old, that is many years old, related to the ability to detain people for 24 hours, well, there is no administrative decision, the Director General of the ISF, that cannot be challenged through the right court. Here, and this is where the lawyers have a role to play. And I think we need to leverage the relationship with the Bar Association in order to keep pushing, because every time the political class feels empowered, feels that it can do whatever it wants, suddenly the judges start ruling in favor of the political class. And every time the political class is in a bit of trouble, judges have some leeway in order to take the right decisions. You mentioned the recent change in Article 47, but let's not forget the Nida al-Watan case, which is very emblematic. A few weeks before October 17, Nida al-Watan was being prosecuted and people were facing Article 23, which would lead them to jail. There was a mandatory minimum related to jail because they attacked the President of the Republic. And then the ruling came 2 weeks after October 19, or October 17, 2019, and the mood had changed, and suddenly the lawyers ruled in favor of the paper. So we need to keep pressure on the political class. We need to keep pressure in order for the judges to understand that they can not only rely on the fact that politicians are here to stay forever. So this is a very essential point. But the other essential point is what is happening in a bit when, for example, I will be meeting with the International Donors Conference, and we all have our contacts with the international supporters of Lebanon. I think accountability needs to be also taken to the Western capitals. We need to request information based on access to information laws in France, in the Netherlands, in the UK, in Canada, in the United States. Also talk to parliamentarians in these countries about the aid that these countries have provided to the Lebanese judiciary and to the Lebanese army, to the Lebanese law enforcement, to see if respect for rule of law and respect for human rights have ever been part of the contract. Whether the trainings that our policemen, our lawyers, and our judges have undergone with international support, with taxpayers' money, included support for human rights and freedom of expression. If the result was negative, if the material, the equipment, the gear that was given to our police was used against freedom of expression, there is accountability to be held also in governments or with governments that have helped Lebanon. So this is no longer a local fight. We need to look at every single front, the judiciary front, the media front, but we need to take that battle to the international donors, because this is what today is the most important for the Lebanese authorities. This is a conversation that I will be having with the French conference in a bit, and I really hope that each international organizations that has, like Human Rights Watch, each Lebanese organization that has connections outside will bring up these cases and ask for accountability for every country that has ever helped our security forces, our judiciary, to make sure that their taxpayers' money was not used, did not go to waste.
I mean, for many years, of dollars in aid was being channeled to Lebanon, and that has essentially propped up this corrupt, rotting political and security system that we have now. And so that, we're not going to the international community to ask for a favor. This is their obligation. They propped up this system that has committed countless rights abuses against its public, and now it must start making sure that its money is no longer going to the same corrupt government agencies, institutions, and security forces that have been committing these rights abuses for decades. And we do have some good precedents. So, for example, in a few years ago, Human Rights Watch released a report about police abuse abuse by police members in stations, particularly against vulnerable communities. And the United Kingdom stopped one of its aid programs to the ISF until it implemented some reforms, at least on paper. It did lead to some improvements in the practices, but at least we know that it is a vehicle of pressure that works. These organizations, these international donors usually do have human rights standards that we can hold them to account for, so that they stop channeling money to the internet, to these Lebanese institutions that have been committing rights abuses. And I'll end with one, now that the Lebanese donor, the French-led donor conference for Lebanon is starting shortly, one of our main recommendations for the donor community has been that they shouldn't channel money through the government anymore. They shouldn't give the Lebanese government a blank check, but rather to channel money through local civil society and organizations and to people on the ground directly. That way, making sure that the money through due diligence and monitoring and evaluation reaches people in need, and that way also sidelining the government while empowering local civil society.
Thank you. One of the things that I think about and really worries me is that when we look at France, when we look at other Western countries, none of them want to topple this existing regime or these political elites, because they always assume there's going to be like a chaotic situation, which is I'm not sure about. And instead, what they use is like the stick with them. Basically, we give you money if you need to accomplish this, if you need to accomplish that. But that's been the strategy for the last 10, 15 years when it comes to human rights. Like, do this, do that, sign this agreement, do this.
Hello,
do
everybody.
that.
Can you hear me?
Hi, Diana.
I'm not sure
we can
if
hear
I'm hearable.
Now we can hear you. We're almost done, Diana.
Muhammad, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, but I need to mute you since.
Hello?
Yes. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that how much this strategy we can really rely on in terms of like depending on these Western countries to create this balance. I mean, we have been testing those governments for the last 15 years. I mean, for the last 30 years, since the 1990, right? With the new after the Civil War, but it really lacked any change. I mean, do we have other tactics? I mean, I just want to get your feedback, like 1 minute each, and we'll be finished with this session.
Things are not the same. I totally agree with you that the international community propped this political class and is still sticking with the political class. But I don't think civil society in Lebanon was very vocal about that in the past. I think this is a new trend. And we need to engage with that, with the international community, using this very clear language that Aya was using earlier, or some ideas that I mentioned. This language was not that clear in the past. The second element is that we are also, for the first time, asking to use mechanisms that were not used in the past, related to access to information laws within these countries, accountability mechanisms within these countries. There are legal actions taken related to banks, related to individual Lebanese politicians, politically exposed people. That these are new tools. And even when it comes to support for the Lebanese government, no, since Cedr, actually no support has come because of corruption. So I'm not saying that the international community is our ally and thank you, Monsieur Macron, or thank you, international community. No, we're very critical towards their role in Lebanon. But at the same time, we would be lacking nuance if we think today, what is happening today, or what happens after Cedr or after the explosion, is similar to the past. Not any single penny was sent to the Lebanese government after Cedr. Significant amounts of money from significant donors. And this is something to understand. When you read the World Bank's report released yesterday, you understand that things are changing, and this is the time to put more pressure.
Aya, last word.
Since we've run out of time, I'll just echo what Ayman said. I completely agree that we have now, unfortunately, due to the impotence of the domestic judiciary, have had to resort to external sources of pressure. And that's really changed the conversation, and I think it will change the calculus of the political elite in Lebanon.
Okay. Thank you so much, Aya, Mazoub. Thank you so much, Ayman Mhanna. Keep doing the great work you're doing, and we'll stay in touch. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you in another session at Bread&Net. Thank you.
Thank you.